Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalehi. I'm the president of Dena Project Management, where we help real estate developers define, design, and build successful projects. My guest for this episode is Justin Aykler, and I'm very happy to have him here. I've known Justin for many years, and I've had the pleasure and opportunity and the privilege of working on multiple of his projects. He's a principal at Grid Developments, and he's also a third-generation real estate developer. With a master's in business administration, an MBA, and over 20 years of experience in real estate development, marketing, and sales, Justin directs Grid's strategic focus, identifying and managing site acquisitions and financing. Grid Developments, that is, focuses on the smaller scale, context-sensitive developments that reflect a growing demand for ownership opportunities, offering alternative to high-rise living and urban sprawl. In this episode, we talk with Justin about how his exposure through his family business and multiple generations of people being involved in this business has helped him, if at all, gain more insights into what makes a successful real estate development career and the project. We talk about some of the market shifts, some of the market trends that he's been witnessing over all these years that he's been involved in this business, the good, bad, and the ugly about what has been happening. We touch base on development charges and some of the challenges that are going on, but we also dive into some of the success stories, how they made use of some opportunities and they made some of the nicest projects that they've worked on in recent years. As always, you can find more information about this episode and our guest on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Even better, please tell others about it and let us grow the show. Thank you and enjoy listening. Hi, Justin. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Hi. Payam, thanks for having me. Good.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here. I'm going to start by asking you to introduce yourself to our audience, please. You and I go way back, but it would be good for our audience to get to know you a little bit as well.
Great. Thanks. My name is Justin Aykler. I am with Grid Developments and Aykler Real Estate. We're a family business. And I've been in the real estate and development and management game for about just over 20 years now. So since 2004, since I finished my MBA. Prior to that, I worked for a couple of years after a BCom at a large company and went back for my MBA after a couple of years. I kind of fell into real estate with the family background and hearing about it growing up. And then also I took a real estate development course in my MBA program. And that kind of piqued my interest. And so I got involved in real estate with the family business after that.
I was just going to say, fell into real estate for you will be a little bit hard. I think you might have been pushed into real estate, no?
Well, no, there was actually, it's funny. I think maybe that's a misconception or it's maybe it's a stereotype, but I had no pressure or nudge to get into the family real estate business. We have a small business. It's property management is one aspect of our business. Development is another aspect of our business, and brokerage is another one. And when I came out of school, I really liked the real estate development course that I took in school. And we were just finishing a 58-unit soft loft project called the Earl Lofts. And coming out of school, I didn't want to go back to the job that I had, or kind of a sabbatical or a leave on to do my MBA. And I decided to help my father finish that development, the 58-unit loft project. And he was just starting a 31-unit conversion loft project that at the time was only 29 units. 29, if you remember, was a critical number for type G loading facilities.
Yep.
And so it was a 29-unit conversion loft condominium project that we went to committee of adjustment a couple times for through the development cycle after approvals to get it up to 31 units. Not by design or not by any sort of motive that we had always thought we would go to committee, just by the fact that we didn't think the retail units and additional amenity space we had were going to be of any value to the building. And so I guess coming out of school and having those two very urban, cool loft projects, seeing the marketing phase, seeing the finishing phase, seeing the construction, it was a great way to start into the business 20 years ago. And the timing worked. So I got into it right then and there.
I know you well enough to know that you're being too modest here. So I'll go back and I'll expand on that history a little bit. And I'll kind of weave into the next question that I was going to ask you is, so my understanding is that your grandfather basically started the business about 50 years ago, if I'm not wrong. And then your
more than that, yeah.
More than that, probably.
Yeah.
Yes. So at this point, your dad has been involved for a long time. Less kudos to him. And then obviously the rest of the family is somewhat involved to different capacities. And it brings you to you, which you're basically the front runner right now, if you may, in some of these new developments that you've been doing. And I've had the pleasure of working with you for the past 7-8 years. I want to look at that, and I'm a big believer. I think I read this from Tony Robbins when he said, "Success leaves clues." And with that lineage that I just explained, because again, I think this is one of the things, and you and I have talked about this before, that some of the things you take for granted, I don't. Is that there's a lineage of 50 years of being in real estate, continuity with a reputation, and you guys have managed to do this through 3 generations, basically. And that's a successful in longevity of a business, which is a hard business. I'm sure you have a lot to say about that.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not necessarily questioning the impact. Obviously, I know the scale of the projects that you guys have worked on. They're not the smallest ones. They're not the largest ones. You're kind of in the sweet spot of the missing middle or the mid-rise, if you may. Let's go back to the beginning. You kind of made it sound like you had no involvement or no exposure, or little exposure growing up. But I would think it was you would have had some indirect exposure, or at least since the time you started for the past 20 years and been directly involved. What would you say have been some of the key lessons that were passed down to you, either before you started or since you started, that you think gave you a head start or valuable insight since you took the helm?
Yeah, I mean, your point about just being around real estate, and I think it's being in a family that was involved in real estate for so many years. Sure, it rubs off on you in a way. Like I remember in grade school and high school, I would go into the office. I would do administrative functions. I would, go to buildings. We were property managers. We were owners. We were developers. I wasn't, a lot of the guests you've had have a construction story or a construction background where they remember going on to their first site. I don't have that experience of that story. I'm not as hands-on as that kind of a background. But I guess by osmosis, for lack of a better word, you tend to you're around conversations, right? And so I always would kind of joke about it as I got a little wise to all of our family gatherings that for very quickly, my grandfather would bring it around to this project or this building or this opportunity. And it would just be a part of our family discussions. There were personal discussions, how everybody's doing in school, how, sports are going, all that kind of stuff is part of the family dynamic. But real estate was talked about quite a bit around the dinner table, if you will. And so, yeah, I guess I would have had an exposure to that. I wouldn't have had a level of detail, I think and a level of detail in the sense that I wouldn't have had this is waiting for you to finish school. You have to get this degree because this will help you in this profession. There was never any push or expectation, frankly. And so that made it very easy in a way to kind of go in because we were doing some very, I call it fun or exciting projects. I mean, they all, one thing I think I've learned is that every project at the beginning is fun and exciting. It's creative. It's full of opportunity. It's full of promise. All you see are the good aspects of the project because you've just convinced yourself to buy a $5 million piece of land. And so you've got vision. And so it's a lot of optimism. And I think when I came out, we were finishing a project, which was great to see that we had completed a second phase. So we had already built 15 towns. Now we were building 58 loft units behind those towns. And then we were starting an industrial steam plant conversion with residential lofts. Like, it was as
complicated,
kind of complicated, but it was also as cool as it could be, right? If you're coming out in your mid-20s, and this is like this is the market that we were going for, and everybody wasn't doing this, and so it was a practical and relevant to come into after having just done my MBA, having done a real estate development course with a professor who had a lot of good insights. And one of the insights I'll talk about that, you talk about it as third generation, what I've learned, or what would be the advice I got that we can say gave me the lessons from that third generation. And I think one of the lessons I got through that program was just, if you can't figure something out on the back of a napkin, you can't go forward with it. And so it's as simple as that. I mean, if you've got a napkin there and you do the math roughly, and it's thoughtful, and you engage your team on it, and the number's in the red, you really don't need to spend too much more time on this. And I think that approach is the approach that my grandfather always took. He was very practical. And another kind of example of that would be, if we're costing things out and we're already in a project and things aren't looking good, at the end of the day, have you got 3 prices? Yeah. You may not like it, but that's what it is. And you're already in it. You got to go forward. You can't get yourself out of things that you're in, and you can't go and find something that isn't there. You can't find a cheaper price if it doesn't exist. You can't push pricing higher if it's not really there on the sales side. And so you just have to take the situation for what it is where you're at and move forward. And that's kind of how we've approached all the challenges and all the projects that we've been involved in.
Hey everyone, Payam here. Just a quick announcement before we go back to the rest of the interview. We have been working on something new at midrise.ca. For those of you who have followed my work throughout the years, you know that I'm very passionate about the mid-rise buildings and the part that they can play in solving our housing crisis issues in Toronto and Canada. And I've had the good fortune and opportunity of working on a number of different mid-rise buildings and study a whole bunch of different systems that work for these buildings, the pros and cons of each system, how they affect the schedule, how they affect the cost, how they affect the performance of each building, and what stages they need to kick in. We have started a new webinar series. It's called Mid-Rise Building Solutions. And we plan to present and review some of the systems that hold the most promise for the mid-rise building typology in each webinar. If you want to learn more, these are all free resources. Please go to our website, midrise.ca. That's mid-rise.ca. And again, thank you for your support. I guess that's another way of saying accept your reality and the reality that you're dealing with at the moment and try to figure it out. And this leads me to another question that I was just going to ask down the road, but I'll bring it up right now. You and I have had multiple phone calls, probably more than I like and you like, throughout the years. Early morning, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., Justin, we have an issue. Right. You're
still on my speed dial, Payam. 10 numbers there.
And we have an issue. We're trying to resolve it. Obviously, on our side, we've been trying to do our best. But one of the things that I know I've talked about this before, is that you've always had that calm demeanor, not freaking out, because I do have other clients per se that do freak out, and or I've had in the past. What gives you that calmness? Is that the same appreciation for reality?
I think it just comes from an it is what it is approach, right? If you're telling me, one thing that I've been so thankful to work with you on these projects and these past 7 or 8 years is that, you don't call without having done the due diligence on, is this really unsolvable? Right. Is this really the situation we're in? You've already tried to mitigate or fix or coordinate or manage around whatever that problem or situation is. And you've already called the consultant team. I'm probably the last one you're calling because it's going to get expensive, or we've got to stop doing something, or I'm trying to think of all the occasions that we've had those conversations. I think because of your background and your credibility, I've been very comfortable. And that's probably why you've sensed I'm calm, because I don't get the sense that you're coming to me and it's my problem. You've already owned the problem, and it makes it a lot easier to accept the problem. And I'm very practical in that sense.
I was not expecting the answer, but I very much appreciate the answer. So thank you very much. And yes, I think as part of our work and our team in the past number of years, we've tried to always be as proactive as possible and not come without solutions in hand, at least. I think that's one way of looking at it. I want to, first of all, thank you again for that. But let's move forward. We talked about your grandfather, you talked about your father, and then I know your dad has been also doing this for a long time, and then yourself. What would be some major trends that you've witnessed shape the market in good or bad ways? Obviously, in very recent memory, everyone is talking about interest rates, the collapse or the crash or the crisis, you pick your word, these days that is happening in the real estate market, the condo market. But take us a little bit further back. Do you see any patterns or any events that you saw that you say, this is a little bit like that? And I'll go back, I'll give the credit of this idea to Ray Dalio in his book, Principles. He calls it another one of those, which you look, when you take a long-term view of the events in an industry, it's another one of those. It just hasn't repeated itself in the last 10 years, so no one remembers that. Do you see any of those?
At the start of your question, the one thing that started to come to mind, and I don't think it's a positive trend, has been, and I think one of your guests most recently or within the last month that I've listened to had brought this up. It's the commoditization of real estate. One thing we haven't done is focus our projects on as a commodity. We haven't kind of widgetized our developments. We haven't crammed as much as we could into our buildings. We've designed for an end user. And I think what the trend has been when I started 20 years ago up until, maybe you could start to see it shift around 2010, maybe a little later. You could go into a sales office, you could look at a floor plan, and they all looked pretty livable. They all looked like your good first-time home. They were geared towards a young person who, was prepared to rent for another 2 years and maybe wait for their home to be built in King West or at Queen and Carlaw or in one of our projects, and was excited about it and would pick the finishes. And you could watch that. I mean, I worked in the sales offices for our projects when we were starting. And, I got my broker's license or my real estate salesperson's license, and I was doing that as well. And, that excitement and that focus on the end user and the owner occupant changed. And I think that caused a bit of a trend, and it was also an affordability issue, but I think it's a bit of a trend in that the marketing and the designs and the suite mix and the layouts and the price per foot, which was very important, right? It all started to trend away from that end user experience, which is what I started to see. I mean, I started in mid 2000s where it was the end user. That's who you were focused on. And I don't think that's a good trend. And I think that's what we're seeing today is that all the projects that are out there that, are under construction or can't get under construction or can't get pre-sales. I mean, I think it's less of a can't get pre-sales issue in 2025. Everybody knows it's a challenge. But I think the investor market has dried up largely because they've realized that there isn't money to be made. There's people who don't want to live in those units anymore.
So basically what I'm hearing you say is that we shifted, or the industry's focus shifted from the quality of life and the livability of a unit for an end user toward what can I sell most and get the best money for, which is true for the most part. Like a lot of investors were looking at the projects, and I know even in your projects, you had some investors come to those types of units. And these days, just the margins are not there. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, and with that being said, what would you think if we just follow that same hypothesis or the trend that you're thinking about? What do you predict or foresee that the next phase of this would be? Do you have any idea?
I think affordability has to improve because otherwise you can't build the units I'm talking about. The 650 square foot starter one bedroom is just too expensive. If you want a parking spot, especially if you want to be in a good neighborhood or in the core. I think it's causing everybody to pause and really take a good look at what's the word, I guess, the downside of the plans of the building they're developing. If the investor market isn't there, we have to focus on the owner-occupant market. If that owner-occupant exists, if that market is there, it's not even there right now. So I think the trend is pause on, the 50-story, 380 to 440 square foot, one bedrooms, making up 60 to 70% of the building, and creating something that's a bit more thoughtful, that's a bit more designed towards maybe some of that short-term market where you've got people in transitional parts of their life, but also mixing it up and making sure that there's owner-occupant units as well, that people can stay there 5, 10, 15 years.
And I think you kind of alluded to my next question, but I'll ask it anyways. You guys have been developing, like, again, for decades now. And you're not. Today, you're not. I know you and I talk a lot, and these days you're not. I know you've been looking, but why aren't you? What has caused the pause? I think it relates to a little bit what we just discussed, but I'll let you elaborate more.
Yeah, I think, look, we've been looking because if we put something under contract, sometimes I call you about construction issues that we can maybe foresee in different sites that we've got under contract, or the size of sites. It's a cost issue, really. I mean, you don't have market comfort, so it's really hard to underwrite the revenue side. You can convince yourself and maybe see on a good enough site, the market will be there eventually. And I haven't seen that yet in terms of the sites that I'm looking at the price point of land and where the cost structure is. And, you have to be very comfortable on a revenue number, and you're not. But if the cost of the land is good enough, then it might make some sense to pursue, with the belief that the revenue number is going to be marginally higher than it is today. Because I think there is a lot of truth and belief to that we're not going to be at, call it $950 to $1,050 a square foot of revenue in the city of Toronto proper forever. I think you're going to see it start to lift again, and you can convince yourself of the thesis that you're going to see $1,200 a foot again. But we haven't seen anything out there that has convinced us that site is something we should pursue in the current cost structure. I think the things that really need to change, I think if that's what we're getting at,
right?
When I started, I go back 20 years ago, I bought my first condominium for $181,000. That's a one bedroom, 650 square foot unit. And it was in one of our projects. And the HST rebate model back then is the same as it was today. You got a federal, you got a provincial portion of HST rebate back when you bought that as an end user. You didn't have to be a first-time home buyer. It's what everybody gets. And the same HST rebate structure is what we have today. And so I was doing math recently and looking at what the net HST was on the unit that I purchased for $181,000 in 2004 or 2005, thereabouts, 5%. So that was what the HST was embedded in the price, right? We all know that the way the market does this in Toronto is HST is included in the price unless you're not a owner occupant, in which case it's clawed back by the builder. But it was about 5%. And if you look at the same unit today, that's probably about $600,000, or you need it to be $600,000, and it's probably 100 square feet smaller if you're lucky at 550 square feet. And I'll say this on the builder side, I'm not even sure you're making much money even at that number. The HST rebate is double. Sorry, the HST is double, not the rebate. You're paying 9 to 10% of HST. You get to the average price of a home in Toronto, that's a home or condo in the GTA, you're at $1,150,000. And latest numbers, your HST now is 11% because the rebate shrinks the higher above $450,000 you go. Without any proper reform to the HST rebate structure, I know they've reformed HST for first-time home buyers under $1 million, or it's scaled up to $1.5 million, which I don't think is enough. Without proper HST rebate reform, if you don't want to take away the HST rebate to $1.5 million for all purchasers, like I think the Conservative government was looking to do, then I think you've got to look at the HST rebate and index that a little differently to what the real prices are now, 21 years after when I bought that condominium, because that's 11% right off the top.
And that's a lot in a condo, like you said, in a market, like you said, in Toronto, that the average is north of $1 million. 11% is $100K. And 100K at these days getting a mortgage, that's quite a bit. That's the difference between getting a house or not getting a house.
And like I don't know if people really know this, but do you think a builder makes 100K on every unit that they produce? If we make 100 units, 100 condominium unit project, we're not making 100K. Nobody's making 100K per unit. The margin isn't 10%. You'd like to think it is, and maybe you can convince yourself at the very start of a project it might be, but it's not there. And I think that's the big eye opener for me, is when I look at the tax base and the cost structure. And I'm not even talking about construction costs. The other big one is development charges, which I'm sure other guests have talked about. I think you had a cost consultant on who he'll know better than anybody else what goes into a construction budget. And it's not just the hard costs. When your development charges are approaching 10 to 12% of the unit price, and now you've got HST at 11%, you're nearing, a quarter of the unit price. It's getting pretty close. Is those two taxes alone? And we haven't even touched other things like, what it costs to hook up to Toronto Hydro, parks levies, another big one. Yeah. All the city fees you pay to go through the development process. So I think until development charges scale back and are reflective of the cost environment, and until HST rebate reforms happen, I think it's going to be very challenging to pencil projects.
I couldn't agree more. You touched on lands cost. You touched on development charge. I have a very vivid memory of you and I going through a phone call about 7 years ago on Halloween night. I think it was 2017 or 2018, I would say, that we're trying to get an application in because in the next morning the development charges will have gone up on one of your jobs. And that's just scary and unreasonable, just to say for the record, that no developer, the fate of a project should not be decided if at 6:30 p.m. on a weeknight, city officials decide
Halloween.
On Halloween, yes.
On Halloween.
And say yes or no. It was a horror show. It was a horror show.
Well, but it was, look, that was a good news story. The one you're bringing up, I was going to talk about today. It was an excellent, that was a good win.
But it could have easily been the other way, what I'm trying to get at. And the fate of that project should have not been decided based on that night alone.
Okay, the fate of we're talking about Sunday school loss, which you were construction manager for. And I think a couple of things made that project successful. That was one of them. Avoiding a development charge increase on November 1st, I think it was 2018, you're probably right, saved a lot of money, and it made the project pencil a little bit better. And all this was done as you're arranging construction, analyzing your numbers. Your budget changes big the next day, which could cause a lender to pause. But we had the opposite scenario happen a year later, where on October 31st, even earlier, we were well prepared. We could not get permit until November 21st for reasons that are more frustrating the more times I recall them. That project was very ready. And so, with that, October 31st, so 2018, that was an exciting day. And we got permit and we paid the development charges, and it made it for the project to push ahead and to be successful. And I think we had the city support there. I mean, that's certainly a project I would love to talk about. I think it's one of the ones that we're most proud of. It was successful in the sense that successful from a construction standpoint. It's a beautiful building, successful from an owner, occupant, and resident standpoint. The residents are happy. It's not a project we hear about in a negative way from our homeowners. Not that we hear about much in a negative way from our homeowners in many of our projects, but it's a beautiful building, and there was a lot that went into that building. I mean, we bought that in 2014, and here we are in 2025. We're just finishing up with 11 years later with the whole Tarion process at the end, which has been fine and pretty manageable. But yeah, that was a great story.
I have to open a bracket here. The credit for the Midrise website and many of the content that we create came from that project. It was an excruciating project to figure out the details. And at some point, I remember I was sitting down and I'm thinking, God, we did all this work and no one's going to ever know about it. So I decided to set up a blog and start writing about what we did on that job. That was way back, a few years back. But let's move on. I want to talk about, you touched on the DC charges. We've talked about DC charges quite a bit on this podcast. There's a movement out there. Different people are taking different initiatives. I just hope that they do it sooner than later. I'll leave it at that because we don't need a post-mortem of once everything dies, it's dead. Like it's going to be very hard to bring things back to life if not moved on quickly. That being said, I think there's another big item out there which you also touched on, and that's the land value these days. And I've had this conversation probably 5 times over the past 2 weeks, but with 5 different entities. That they have lands that they bought under the impression that they're going to quickly turn it into condos, sell for $1,300, $1,400 a square foot. And now they're stuck with a piece of land, which basically the entitlement, if it's there, or the potential for the entitlement on it is almost close to zero. First of all, would you agree with my assessment? And second, what's your take on where this is going to go next?
Just to reframe, so the entitlement and the close to zero, are we saying kind of the land value is close to zero effectively based on
no, what I'm saying is that
numbers, the residual?
if someone paid for a piece of land just because they could have turned it into an 8-story condo with 60, 70 units, which would have sold at some point for $1,300 a square foot, they paid that price for the land. And now 3 years later, 4 years later, that's just not the reality. At least that's what I'm seeing out there. I'm hearing out there that parcel of land with the, let's say, 6 rental units on it. I think you and I even talked about one of them a few weeks ago. 6 rental units generated income. From a net perspective of finance and numbers, that land is not worth as much as it was worth. Probably not even half of it when they bought for it. Is that accurate way of looking at it, you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are in that situation where if you underwrote a revenue value and, hopefully you underwrote an accurate cost base, which I think is a tough thing to do in this last, call it 4 or 5 years. It was hard to know what your hard costs were going to be. You knew your soft costs were going to go up. Then you're squeezed at both ends where you underwrote, let's say, at a cost base you thought would be less on the hard cost side. You underwrote at a revenue side number that you thought would be higher. I think this goes back to the approach I think anybody in that situation has to take. Unfortunately, you just got to wait. I mean, it's a practical problem. You can't change your way out of it. You can't design your way around that problem. I mean, there's problems you could design your way around. That's the other, I think, lesson I learned. If I could point to the 3-generation lesson, that's probably a lesson I learned best from my father and from my partner, George. There's always these problems that come up. But, there's usually a solution, and it's usually a solution once your consultant team gets involved, once you get involved, and once you have a design team that's flexible and that's creative and that's, I guess, vested with you, there's a design solution that can exist. I think this problem you're describing, there's no design solution. You can't design your way around revenue that's not there. And so I think it's just a time solution, or hopefully the parameters of the project aren't too tight and it can be a rental project, because purpose-built rental does have some relief from some of the things that I'm suggesting are effectively stopping development right now, right? With the development charges being low, with HST being a moot point, right? There's no HST on rental housing. So you've got some relief to push yourselves that way, and maybe that is something that makes sense. Does that answer your question? I think that's all you can do.
That's very true. And I want to flip it and I want to tie it into the next topic of our conversation. I want to segue from this conversation into non-for-profit entities and affordable housing. And you, like you just mentioned, you guys did a project basically acting as development manager. I'm not necessarily sure what was your title, but it was probably development manager or
that's right,
some sort of consulting. Yeah. Okay. So on that capacity, you work with a nonprofit, you developed these new units in addition to an existing building. And I know you had mentioned previously that you are looking at repeating that model. And as you mentioned, it got a lot of support from City of Toronto and the government, different levels of government for that. What would you say were your biggest lessons learned for dealing with that sector of the market, which is probably not that very common for other developers to do? And what do you think if they're looking at a partner? If there's a nonprofit who says, listen, we have so much money, we want to start a new project, and we need a partner to come in and basically take this through, stick handle the process, either go buy another piece of property and build it for us, or we have a piece of property and come do something with it. Maybe walk us through that dynamic, like from both sides.
So in our sense, I mean, we were managing that building already for the nonprofit for many, many years. And we had put a plan on it in 2017, I'd say, like quite a while ago, 2018, 2017, to expand the building. It was easier for us because the land was there. I think to acquire for a nonprofit is much more difficult. I think if they're going to be involved in a project, they can get involved with a portion of the units. And I think a portion of the units can be market and can be nonprofit, which is what we have in our project, although all the new units we added were nonprofit. I don't know if there's much appetite out there for that, though. And I think it's largely related to the viability, right? The nonprofit rents were scaled down, or I should say the affordable rents in the city of Toronto were scaled down recently, or maybe last year, to an income-based approach. So it's much harder to underwrite these. I don't know exactly how that would work for a market developer outside of just you have your market units and you have your nonprofit units. It's very unique, the situation that we had. Having the land for free, having the plan and the city behind us and approving the project, having the open doors, kind of development charge grants, site plan grants, property tax forgiveness, all that stuff, parks land forgiveness, help to make that viable. But you're right, you do still need a nonprofit with capital. And I don't know if a nonprofit with capital has a mandate to go out and buy land to start ground up on a risky endeavor. And I think that's one of the challenges.
So that's just a different risk profile in your thought, that they might prefer to come in and buy either a finished or semi-finished project and just maybe convert it rather than have to go through the whole uncertainty of many years of development.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I mean, that's what your nonprofit mandate doesn't allow for that level of risky investment, is right. What our understanding is. And I think there are examples out there of projects where you've got the nonprofit taking 60 units and the market rental having 200 units. I don't know exactly how the capital stack works. I don't think the ownership is nonprofit. I think they become the proponent really for their nonprofit units. But it's something that we've investigated. We have nonprofits behind it. But nonprofits with a lot of money, I mean, they could go out and approach developers with stale sites and say, this is something we want to get involved in. Would you look at a purpose-built rental project with, call it 20%? I think there's thresholds based on the incentives you get. And I think it's 20% affordable. Gets you quite a lot of support.
So hypothetically, if you're someone who picked up a piece of land and have some sort of a financial backing, perhaps not enough to pull a project on your own, but you could go in and essentially sell the idea of a new project or some version of a project to a nonprofit who has the funding but doesn't necessarily want to take on all the risk and be involved in the whole thing. So that could potentially be a way out.
Yeah, I think there's hybrid approaches out there.
Okay, that's good. In terms of policies, in terms of regulations, guidelines, and other stuff that has been going on, we touched on the DCs. When you look at what you've been through over the past few years, what you intend to do over the next few years, what are some of the biggest hurdles when it comes to policies, directions? You touched on Type G. I know we had issues with angular plane before. Do you feel like the whole thing is moving in the right direction?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. You now have Type G forgiveness up to 60 units. You've got angular plane forgiveness. You've got a lot more flexibility on heights, not being the width of the right of way or 80% of the width of the right of way, depending on where you are. I think there's a lot of appetite at the city to make those concessions. I think it's still not enough, though. And I think that's what the market's showing as well, that it's still not enough to get things unlocked. And the costs are still too high for what your revenue base is.
I guess if we step away from the cost side of it, what would you like to see changed?
I think if we step away from the cost side, I mean, some of the city policies that we've seen recently have been great, but I would suggest that they may not go far enough to promote some of the projects that the city would really like to see. And so I'm talking mainly about mid-rise height. mid-rise projects, missing middle projects, anything, over 10 units where you need site plan approval. But, under 500 units, it still has the same cost structure to undertake. So you've got the same costs for your design consultants. You've got your same costs for parks levies. Of course, it's indexed to the value of the site. You've got your same municipal costs. And so I would suggest that even though you've got this new major streets policy where you've got 6-story buildings that are approved as of right now on some of the major streets in the city of Toronto, up to 60 units without a type G, up to 60 units in a 6-story form, it's still very difficult to pencil these projects. And I think without some reform, I know I'm going back to the cost side here, but without some reform that maybe acknowledges the difference in these types of projects and their burden in terms of some of those soft costs, consultant costs, site servicing costs, Toronto Hydro costs, without acknowledging that these projects have a higher cost base per unit, a higher cost per square foot, you're really not going to see that much done until the market improves. And so if you're not relying on the market to create the conditions by which housing can be built again, in I would say both a rental and a condominium form, then I think it might be something to look at if the city says, okay, anything under 10 stories or under 8 stories, or even depending on the width of the right-of-way and how high they want to see these buildings, or under 60 units, even if you take those major streets buildings, which are 6 stories and under 60 units, and say your development charges are going to be, deferred, and defer it, out even indefinitely, or your development charges will be 50% of what they now are. And I think you need to create some economic relief for some of these smaller projects that will really help the city see those projects actually come to fruition. Because right now, the policy changes, while as good as they are, they're really not going to get the number of housing units built that they need. And they won't get these projects done with any meaningful sort of mass on major streets without looking at how difficult it is for these projects to pencil. So I know I went back to the cost side, but I do think it is still a policy argument as well to say that you got to start looking at these mid-rise projects a little differently than you look at for say a 500-unit high-rise project, just because they're both condominiums and just because they're both greater than 10 units. So that's what I'd like to see some progressive change on at the City of Toronto.
If you go back to yourself 20 years ago when you were just starting, are there any significant pointers that you would tell yourself, you know what, don't make that mistake, don't fall for this thing, or do this one instead? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I don't even have to go back 20 years to kind of have a lesson. I think I can go back 10 years when we were very active and we were developing a handful of sites in the City of Toronto, townhouses and stacked towns, and the Heritage Church conversion project that you were helping us on, and mid-rise building. And I think the lesson that I would say to myself 20 years ago is this isn't easy. It looks easy because everybody seems to be successful doing it. It looks easy because pre-sales are easy right now. It looks easy because the model and the finishes and the demand, it's all there. And I think that's not the reality of this industry. And I think everybody's now been reminded of that. And as recently as 10 years ago, the optimism was just so great. You could sell, you had a cost structure you were comfortable with. I mean, I don't remember going in with a cost budget and getting a rude awakening that it's really very different a year later. And that's what we've seen over 2022 to 2024, even as early as 2021 from 2020, right? You did the budget for us at 136 Kingston Road, and we're starting construction in late 2021. It was a very different story. And I don't think we could all appreciate how quickly things can change, not just on the market side, but on the cost side. And there's all these pitfalls that we've seen. There's policy, there's development charges, and there's market risk, and there's construction problems, and there's groundwater. There's there's environmental risk.
there's all these risks out there that are theoretical, that are managed as you go through the process, but are very, very real. And I think it's easy to be optimistic, and it's very difficult to think that they're all going to come to fruition, and protect against that, be it in your design or in your pricing, in your acquisition. It was all very stable, and then it's not. And I think the one lesson I have out of this last 10 years, not even 20, is that nothing in this industry is really very easy. It just looked easy for a while.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy, and a lot of things can get complicated very quickly. Why don't you walk us through some of the typical, or I guess more successful capital structures that you've had on your projects and which you think our audience could learn from it?
Sure. So I think capital structure, when you talk about that, and I know you had a finance guy on your podcast a little while back, and there was a lot of
Bray, yes, Martin Bray, formerly from Altus. That's a good episode for people to listen as well.
So there was a lot of discussion on equity partners and financial stack or capital stack. We're not that sophisticated, and we haven't been. We've been pretty basic when it comes to our structure. We buy land, we put in some of our money, and we get a lender for the remainder of it. Then and was the model, which has changed, we would pre-sell. We would have purchaser deposits that would then be bonded or insured. Those deposits would get into the capital stack, and they would be used in the project. And then we'd get our pre-sales, get our site plan, get our building permit, go pay for the building permit and all those development charges, and you'd use that with a conventional construction loan of about 70% loan to cost. That's our model. That's what we've done over the last several years on most of our projects, including Sunday school lofts. And I think there's a lot of benefit to that model, especially when things aren't going so well. We don't take on too much debt. We don't take on secondary debt and financing that gets expensive. And it's been helpful for us in terms of keeping our financing costs down. Our ROI might not be the highest, or our IRR might not be the highest for what's in there. But I think one thing that maybe is overlooked as we've talked about the projects and the cost of the projects is the satisfaction and fulfillment of finishing a project. I mean, you have your IRR, which is great. You hopefully make money at the end of the day. You've worked on something for 5 to 8 years that you can look at and be satisfied with and feel proud of. And I think that's the other real, maybe missing positive effect or missing benefit that developers get, is they get to see that they've created something, and hopefully it's something they're proud of.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the satisfaction that comes from driving by that site that you spent that many hours and that many years on it and built something. I can attest to that even as a kid, when my dad used to design buildings and he would take us on these rides and say, oh, we built that building. That was definitely a feeling that did factor in my decision doing what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
I wanted to circle back quickly. Simplicity of your financial setup, basically. Mm-hmm. And maybe being a little bit more conservative and cautious. And I'm just going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say you were also trying to be more long-term, think about it more long-term, trying to protect the bottom part. Don't go too low. Don't lose too much money. If I'm reading that right, would you think that that has been a common thread over the past 50 years through the generational investments thesis?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that was one thing that I learned very early on, is 50 years ago, the capital structure wasn't as sophisticated, certainly as it can be now. There weren't as many equity or mezzanine or partnership opportunities. But one lesson, I've always had instilled is you don't mortgage your future to pay for what you're doing right now. And so we would only bite off what we could chew, and we would do it independently without a need to raise other capital, without a need to, get further indebted. And so far it's worked. Maybe we haven't grown as quickly as maybe some of the other developers that would be in our similar kind of project scale, but we're also able to sleep at night and be a lot more comfortable with the decisions that we're making and with the risk. It's a little bit more of a conservative risk profile. That's a good way to describe it.
And I think you're probably just not alone as well. I know we had Jonathan Diamond on this podcast a while ago, and they have a somewhat of a similar background in their family that they started many decades ago. And he pretty much said the same thing, that from a generational perspective, the long-term view has allowed them to make some decisions differently that allows you to weather these types of situations, the ups and downs. You don't make as much money, because I actually did in that episode. I asked Jonathan, he was describing his next project, and in my mind, I'm running the numbers. I'm like, you can't be making that much money on that job. It sounds too expensive. And he didn't seem to be too worried about it, because again, he had the long-term view of things. That's my assumption on it. And I'm happy to see that you're seconding that, basically.
Yeah, I mean, we take that view if we're going to build purpose-built rental, which I think is what they were describing in Jonathan's podcast. Yeah, so I mean, that's our view. We're doing a little purpose-built rental, taking advantage of a fourplex missing middle policy and doing a fourplex and a lane house, and hopefully not having to stagger them so we can avoid the development charges. And we'll see how it goes. It's not as easy to underwrite as a condominium. You don't have exit sales. You don't have a profit number. You have a cost number and what you think the value will be at the end of the day based on some of the rents that you're projecting. And you're going to leave some equity in? Yes. You're going to have some takeout financing? Yes. What will the rate be? For a while there, it was hard to know, but now it looks pretty stable. But yeah, it's not, this isn't huge money-making stuff. This is creation of housing for, I talked about that other benefit you get, and it's not always the bottom line benefit. It's being able to drive by and see that now you've created 5 new units of housing for families in Toronto in an urban context, well-designed, well-built, that you can now have. So certainly a longer-term approach for that.
That's great, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to wrap this up by asking you about the next generation of the Ayklers. Mm-hmm. Obviously, your kids are still little, but would you let them continue in your footsteps? Do you want them to continue your footsteps? And if so, what would be the advice you give them?
I've never really thought about that. My kids are young, you know that. I've got an 8-year-old and a 15-year-old. I guess 15 isn't that young. And I think, you want your children, I think, to do whatever that makes them the happiest, because it's a long career, right? You have a long career working and you want to be happy at what you're doing. If real estate and real estate development and sales are something that they're happy to do and want to become involved in, I'm definitely supportive of that. I think it's funny. I started this podcast by saying I never had any push, and I don't think I'm a dad that's going to push kids to one career choice or another, but I can certainly see some advantages if that's your desire and aptitude to get into real estate. I can certainly see some advantages to different undergraduate or graduate programs that would be helpful to differentiate yourself a little bit if you wanted to get into that field. And probably it's not the programs I took. It's programs that are more geared to what maybe you've taken. You're an engineer or architecture or urban planning and urban design. I mean, these are all very practical bases by which to have a real estate development career. Finance can be one as well, of course. In law, we know there's a lot of developers out there who started in finance. But I think going through some of the technical or creative training is probably a good start. So I think if that time comes where there's an interest in that career path and this career path, then that would be the one thing I would encourage, rather than, yeah, sure, here you go. Are you 18? And you come right on board. I think we've never had that approach, certainly above me and the family. It's never been an approach of, okay, now you're out of school, you're going to come work here. That's not the approach we take. That's not the approach I will take, but I will certainly take a more encouraging approach to certain programs that might help you if that's the career you want to pursue.
Thank you very much, Justin. This has been fun. As
Thanks,
always, one of our many conversations. And who knows, maybe in a few years we revisit that last question and you can give us an update in terms of the next generation.
That'd be great.
They're going.
Okay.
Thank you for being here today.
Thanks.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is the top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, and or if you with the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.